As the United States prepared to enter the First World War, many native-born Americans advocated 100% Americanism. They believed that immigrants had to give up their loyalty to their homelands for the U.S. to triumph abroad. Government propaganda campaigns targeted immigrant communities to make sure that immigrants understood that supporting the war effort was their responsibility. Immigrants were supposed to buy Liberty bonds and donate money to the Red Cross to demonstrate their commitment to freedom and democracy. Those who maintained a hyphenated identity, like German American, threatened the security of the state. The cartoon, 10 Little Hyphens, had captions based on a children's rhyme and showed disloyal immigrants disappearing one at a time. 10 little hyphens sitting on line. Uncle Sam jailed one, and then there were 9. 9 little hyphens hiding among freight. One dropped a great big bomb, and that left 8. 8 little hyphens talking war in heaven. One cheered for fatherland, and that left 7. Although the disloyalty of German immigrants had been one of the government's great fears, events in Russia helped turn Americans' attention toward a new threat: the dangers of radicalism. In 1917, American officials watched in horror as Russia's government devolved into chaos. During the February Revolution, Tsar Nicholas II stepped down from power, leading to the possibility of the Russians creating a democracy. But the promise of the February Revolution quickly faded when Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and his Bolshevik followers seized control of the Russian government in October. Lenin had told the Russian people that he would give them peace, land, and bread. Once in power, he proceeded to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ending Russia's part in the war against Germany. American officials mistakenly believed that the German government was the force behind Lenin's successful revolution and blamed the Germans for Russia's decision to exit the war. On the home front, Americans combined the threat of German immigrants with the fear of immigrants supporting Bolshevism and other radical ideas. Once the war was over, American officials would come to think that a similar revolution could take place in the United States if they did not prevent the spread of radical ideas at home. Even though there was little chance that radicals would destroy American democracy, a series of strikes and terrorist attacks in 1919 convinced many Americans that the threat was real. The turbulence began in January when Seattle shipyard workers decided to go on strike. On February 6th, workers throughout the city joined them, setting off a general strike which closed down much of Seattle. Seattle citizens had cleared grocery store shelves and began purchasing guns in preparation, but the strike lasted for less than a week. Opponents of the strike argued that radicals had inspired this un-American approach to solving labor disputes. They found a leader in Seattle's mayor, Ole Hansen, who used his anti-radicalism to turn himself into a national hero. The Seattle General Strike was followed by major strikes in both the steel and coal industries. Even the Boston Police Department went on strike in the fall of 1919. As the labor disputes spread and sometimes turned violent, Americans questioned whether radicals who wanted revolution were behind the unrest. One of the radical groups which caused concern was the Industrial Workers of the World. Founded in 1905, the IWW, or the Wobblies as their members were often called, advocated the creation of one big union. The group's leaders, including Big Bill Haywood, an American-born radical and former miner, believed that in the war between labor and capital, workers needed to use violence. The United States had experienced labor violence and even acts of terrorism before, such as the bombing in Chicago's Haymarket Square in 1886, and the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901. With the end of the war and the success of the Bolshevik Revolution abroad, violence flared once again. At the end of April 1919, Thomas Hardwick, a senator from Georgia who supported deporting anarchists, received a package in the mail which exploded in his maid's hands. Once descriptions of the bomb appeared in the daily newspapers, a postal employee remembered having set aside over a dozen similar packages for insufficient postage. Upon further investigation, the government discovered that terrorists had intended to assassinate at least 30 notable Americans, from prominent officials to wealthy businessmen, on May 1st. One of the targets was Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Like other anti-radical politicians, Palmer portrayed himself as upholding the American values that radicalism sought to destroy, including democratic government, religion, and the family. In 1920, Palmer remembered back, describing the climate in which the bombings took place and the dangers of Bolshevism.
Like a prairie fire, the blaze of revolution was sweeping over every American institution of law and order a year ago. It was eating its way into the homes of the American workmen. Its sharp tongues of revolutionary heat were licking the altars of the churches, leaping into the belfry of the school bell, crawling into the sacred corners of American homes, seeking to replace marriage vows with libertine laws, burning up the foundations of society. A. Mitchell Palmer.
On June 2nd, anarchist bombs went off in 8 cities. One destroyed part of the Attorney General's home. Here was proof of radicalism literally threatening the American family. The escalating violence and coordinated attacks convinced Palmer that radicals were trying to bring down the U.S. government. In response, the Bureau of Investigation, now the FBI, began preparing to raid radical organizations. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the Bureau's new radical division, managed the operation. Federal agents focused on capturing foreign-born radicals, since aliens who had advocated the violent overthrow of the U.S. government were subject to deportation. In November 1919, agents raided branches of the Union of Russian Workers, a relatively small anarchist group. Once captured and given hearings in front of immigration inspectors, the government sent the accused radicals to New York's Ellis Island in preparation for deportation. The two most famous of the men and women who the government planned to deport were Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman. Longtime collaborators and proponents of anarchism, both Goldman and Berkman had reputations for supporting the use of violence. Berkman had spent 14 years in prison for the shooting of Henry Clay Frick, a wealthy businessman, in 1892. Goldman had made a name for herself by lecturing at labor rallies, supporting un-American ideas like free love, and publishing a radical magazine called Mother Earth. Both had just been released from prison for violating the Wartime Espionage and Sedition Acts by speaking out against the draft. Berkman refused to answer any of the inspector's questions at the immigration hearing the government held for him in prison, preferring to read a statement instead.
I deny the right of anyone, individually or collectively, to set upon inquisition of thought. Thought is or should be free. My social views and political opinions are my personal concern. I owe no one responsibility for them. For the government to attempt to control thought, to prescribe certain opinions and proscribe others, is the height of despotism. Alexander Berkman.
Goldman held out little hope that she would not be deported, but she wanted to expose the hypocrisy of the American government.
I had always longed to revisit Russia, and after the February-October Revolution, I had definitely decided to return to my native land to help in its reconstruction. But I wanted to go of my own free will, at my own expense, and I denied the right of the government to force me. I was aware of its brutal strength, but I did not propose to submit without a fight. Emma Goldman.
She argued that she had the right to American citizenship because she had been married to an American citizen. However, the government denied her claim. On December 21, 1919, Berkman and Goldman were deported aboard the USS Beaufort, an old Army transport. The ship, which became known in the American press as the Soviet Ark, also carried members of the Union of Russian Workers arrested in the November raids, in addition to other immigrants scheduled for deportation. Attorney General Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover both hoped that the sailing of the Buford was just the beginning. The Bureau of Investigation used the November raids against the Union of Russian Workers as practice for a larger set of raids against the Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party. On January 2, 1920, agents began arresting thousands of suspected radicals during coordinated raids in 33 cities. The agents believed that as long as they could prove that an alien belonged to either of the two communist organizations, they had enough evidence to justify deportation. They collected membership books and radical literature from the aliens to create what they considered perfect cases. American newspapers eagerly reported details of the raids and the progress the government was making towards destroying the threat of revolution in the United States. Despite his public success, Palmer faced criticism from American-born reformers as well as civil libertarians about the Department of Justice's conduct during the raids. Ultimately, the Department of Labor would make the final decisions in individual cases. The Assistant Secretary of Labor, Louis Freeland Post, rejected much of the Department of Justice's understanding about how cases should be decided, including the assumption that membership in a proscribed organization constituted grounds for deportation. After sifting through well over 2,000 files, Post deported 556 immigrants, a disappointing number for those who envisioned a fleet of Soviet arks. In response, the Department of Justice attacked Post, accusing him of encouraging the spread of radicalism and of being a radical himself. The Congress held a hearing to determine whether or not Post deserved to be impeached. In the pamphlet, To the American People, Report upon the Illegal Practices of the United States Department of Justice, 12 prominent lawyers, including future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, came to Post's defense. They argued that government agents arrested immigrants without warrants and conducted illegal searches. Moreover, the government set bail on aliens at exorbitantly high rates to prevent them from gaining their freedom before they could be deported. As 1920 wore on, and the violent revolution that Palmer feared never occurred, more Americans were willing to listen.